Sit up.
I think where we usually start with these things is sort of asking you how you got involved in this sort of conservation work. Tell us a little about yourself and how you got involved in this region and sort of what you've done, kind of a biographical.
Well, I was born in El Paso, so I always had a romance after I left El Paso, coming back to maybe not El Paso, but the Southwest. And then when I was in my 20s, I came down here during the summer only and gave gourmet bird tours of the Americans, of the U.S. side, Sky Islands. And so while I was wandering around the Chiricahuas and the Santa Ritas, I kind of fell in love with it, especially South Fork and the Magellan Pine Oak Woodlands. And so I've always wanted to come back. And so I came back about 26 years ago, I guess, and started just as a kind of maniacal naturalist, beginning to know about that. But while I was in California, I was also in public office and mostly concerned with water, and got involved with the California side of the water issue around the Colorado. And was on the Drought Emergency Task Force in 1976 and all that kind of stuff. So by the time I got here, I was very, in fact, I think the first talk I ever did was on the Colorado River in Tucson. And so I had already been interested both in the wildlife and water. And that seemed to always go back and forth. When I was at the Office of Arid Studies, I went to Africa a lot. And that was they don't care about specialties when you're in Africa. You just have to know what you're doing. And so there the water and wildlife came very close together. I worked on Lake Chad, I worked on biodiversity in Mali, which is really the Niger River, worked on the Senegal River in Senegal. So the water and wildlife kept on getting closer and closer during that whole period of time. And the conservation stuff started back when I was an elected official. I learned about in-stream flows and tried to protect a little creek when the San Andreas Fault. I made sure the flyway lagoon. Again, it was always water and wildlife, water and wildlife. And then all the work, a lot of the work I did in Africa had to do with water and wildlife or with natural resource management. So at that point, how do you say it? I became known as an arid land person, where there wasn't water, rather than where there was water. And that, of course, led during the 80s to my going across the border here, since I was living in Tucson, mostly with Tony Burgess, and just exploring. I had never been to the Pentecotes. I had never been, around the Sonoran uplands. I'd never seen tree morning glories or anything like that, so it was all a very exciting period of time. And then in the early 90s, I was asked to give the plenary for the first Sky Island Madrid Archipelago Conference. And so I sat down and I looked at Sky Island archipelagos all over the planet, which it turned out no one else had done, which was odd in itself, and found about 9 or 10 of them, and realized how unique this one was because it went from the temperate zones down to the subtropics, where all the other Sky Islands had much, were either east-west or had a much more limited latitude and longitude. And then I began to see it's also the place with the lowest pass in the Rocky Mountains, like Laird Benner. And so we also had an overflow from the Great Plains into the grasslands of Arizona. So everything started to become even more interesting at that point. And so that's pretty much, what I've been doing. Because of my work in Africa in natural resources management, my most recent work has been in New Mexico, with the state of New Mexico, and again, it kind of went back to my California life, and that's mostly been looking at first, what would the dream be if you could do everything you wanted without all the political barriers to create a kind of renewable energy situation in New Mexico? And then what is the doable dreams given water limitations for energy and, all other kinds of limitations. Then after we did that, we were asked to do one on food and farming and food systems and livestock, which also was really interesting for me because I've been looking at livestock in Africa for so long. So I got to see how the two compared. And because there are 22 sovereign nations in New Mexico and incredible cuisines and incredible water issues on the Pecos and the Rio Grande, as well as the Upper Colorado, it all seemed like that was a very fun project. And so I just finished that. And that one also then led to my understanding about cross-border issues, not just the natural history issues of the Sky Islands and conservation, but for instance, in New Mexico is now the largest producer of pecans in the United States, more so than Georgia and Texas. And the pecans then go to the maquiladoras in Mexico where they're shelled, and the jumbos come back to the United States for a high price. Other pieces go everywhere from North Korea to Mexico. And then when Mexican farmers saw how much money was being made in this trade, they started to grow pecans themselves. So now there's kind of a competition between Chihuahuans, mostly Chihuahuan pecan growers, and New Mexican pecan growers for the use of the maquiladoras, which now have gone to an international global trade. 46 million tons of pecans go to China every year, just to give you an idea. And so I began to see that no matter what happens, these kinds of regional agricultures really remain kind of immune in a funny way from politics. Not to say that NAFTA hasn't hugely hurt the border by displacing so many milpo farmers, but there's also this other thing going on. 350,000 cattle come across the border at Santa Teresa every year, and we finish them off on Kansas corn and soy, and then the prime cuts, which is not a Mexican cut, but the prime cuts then are fresh frozen and sent back to Mexico City. So there's all this trade that is going back and forth that is a little bit immune from politics in a funny way. Not that corn isn't heavily involved in politics, but it keeps on going, and people have relationships so that if you go to the Pecan Association meeting of the year, it's completely bilingual. Everybody's talking to each other. They're more concerned with weevil that's coming from West Texas than they are, if Obama's president or Calderon is president. They want to know how if the pecan industry should go organic and compete with Southern California or not. I mean, those are the kinds of discussions that go on. So there's this, although we always try to talk about those conflicts, there's actually a great deal of commerce that is bringing both sides together. We could do this. The competition that's hurting New Mexico right now is Chile, because you can grow chilies are very labor intensive. And so actually China just produced its first salsa. And is exporting salsa to the United States. And, yeah, and but on the other hand, all the organic winter foods come from the Yaqui Valley, the Yaqui River Valley. Almost all of the Southwest is fed by the Sonoran, not as much Chihuahua in the winter. And so this is great, and that's the stuff that really holds families together.
When you were at the Office of Arid Lands, I'm just wondering a little bit about your notion about the role of the University of Arizona as a sort of convener, an institution that promotes this kind of binational relationship stuff. Other people have talked about Tumamoc Hill and the long heritage there. special collections, the library, and its interest, particularly in the culture, as being a sort of place. Was there reasons why you went to Airland Studies?
Oh, I went to Airland Studies mostly because of Africa. You know.
I see. Okay.
And I'm not the person to ask because I got blackballed by the university because I found the Mount Graham red squirrel on the highest of the Sky Islands, and it interfered with the and it interfered with the astrophysical agenda, and so I was essentially removed from astrophysical, and I've never had a job in all of Arizona since that time for saying that the astrophysical facilities might hurt probably one of the most endangered small mammal in the country.
Well, I still have a red squirrel one of my students gave me from all of it. It still sits on my desk, so I'm reminded of that.
Yeah. I mean, so my connection to the university, to put it mildly.
We'll drop that.
No, I mean, it's interesting because in a way, you know, it's the flip side.
Yes.
U of A is not, is a corporation basically, and when something interferes with its major funding efforts, and I think 20 or 30% of all funding in research goes to the astronomy departments, it's not, I don't think it should be considered a friendly or an unfriendly institution.
No,
I think it's a very selfish, self-interested institution, and so if it works towards money, sure. If it doesn't, then they're not that interested. And I think that's an important aspect to at least state about the university, is that although Tumama Killer was great, I mean, I used to be up there all the time, and it hasn't really made a major, like the Udall Center hasn't really done much to help binational relations. And that's part of what you're talking about. I think we, as a private group in Northern Jaguar Project or in the Yaqui Watershed Alliance, are not confined or not as nervous or fearful about how we go about things. And the university has been very fearful to be imaginative.
Right.
You know, they say.
It's interesting that you should talk about this, because we were just talking about this on the car incoming, about the relative importance of people working through networks and institutions. And by institutions, we're talking about organizations like the University of Arizona or Tumamaquil or Airland, but we're also talking about laws and like the biosphere in the upper Gulf. And I think that people end up being the more important instigators of this. And when, in listening to other people, they say that it takes people to set up institutions, but after that, the institutions are the more important thing. Have you got some reflections on?
Yeah, I think there are really two kinds of people. There are Genesis people, and people who are the originators, and they can't come from agencies or institutions because those are too cloistered. The intellect is too cloistered. And so I think you always have a Genesis group. And I was the editor of the Whole Earth Catalog for Natural History and Environment. And we really were popular because the universities had lost touch with what students really needed to know. I mean, at that point, it was solar energy, it was water conservation, it was, you know, all that kind of stuff. And we offered it in the catalog.
Yeah.
And gradually that catalog got absorbed into the university curricula and schools. So we kind of lost our major focus, not because we had been absorbed, but there's always that outside, you know, they say in the corporate world, out of the box thinking. I mean, I actually like the phrase, but that's what they use. And you can't get very many out of the box thinking inside these institutions. Mm-hmm. And so you continually have that dialogue. And then you have the kind of person who's a leader, not as a Genesis person, but as a sustainable person inside an institution who knows how to sustain the institution. And that can become good, I mean, you know, or it can really lead, like in many of the water agencies, where the whole purpose of the agency is to continue itself and not to actually do the job it was set up to do. And, I think the Salt River Project is probably the best one in Arizona, which is completely there just to keep itself going. Army Corps of Engineers is typical of that, where they have projects just to keep, they're looking for projects all the time. It doesn't, and they've lost the mission statement or the vision statement. And that was the same with this project we did in New Mexico. The reason it had to come from pioneers and could not come from within the agencies or within NMSU or NMU was that it needed somehow to break out of the normal ways of looking at things. And, for instance, I never used the word sustainability once.
Yeah.
I mean, it's that kind of word you've got to avoid these days.
Well, it's interesting that you talk about it that way. We put then the Northern Jaguar Project in a different category because it's not that kind of institutions. It's really a non-governmental organization, a civil society organization. You wouldn't call that an institution.
No.
Right.
No, not yet anyway.
Okay. And how would you compare the importance of that kind of endeavor with these more formalized institutions?
Well, I mean, I think we were nimble.
Okay, good.
We have, the university has what overhead? Like 60% overhead. We had a 5% overhead. Or less, and so we could use our money much more efficiently. We had an incredible passion on the part of the board. So we had an activist board. We didn't have a board.
Everybody works.
Everybody worked. Everybody assigned themselves I'm science coordinator. Diana was the funding president. Carlos Lopez really worked in the field. Oscar Moctezuma was head of the major conservation organization. The other thing about it is we could choose. There were no political criteria for choosing who our board members were. So we chose really good, great board members, that were very effective in different realms. So we had Craig Miller from Defenders of Wildlife, Susan Anderson from TNC,
Jeff Williamson from the Phoenix Zoo.
Right. I mean, we were able to put together, and so the nimble, effective ability to kind of divide efficiencies and, and also ways that, we found out that Mexico and the U.S. had not really formed what we call it, on-the-ground, doable binational organizations. Most of them were very diplomatic. They had to do with diplomacy. They had to do with policy wonking, is what we would call it, like big making policies. So we decided we just do a project. Naturally, it came to us. We didn't, and so we invented ourselves and asked us to help them funnel money from the United States to expand the reserve. And Diana can tell it, or I can tell it. I mean, Naturally really started this. And they started it by getting Bancomex, or Banamex, I'm not sure which one, to issue commemorative coins to endangered species of Mexico. And then they were given 150 full sets, and then Bancomex had the others, and they sold those to collectors. And with that money, they bought the first 10,000 acres. So they had a 10,000 acre reserve first, and then realized that's not big enough for a jaguar. So they came to us and said, could we help find money to, expand the reserve? And that was our first relationship. And let me say that we, to be completely blunt, we've never really had a good MOU, memorandum of understanding.
Okay.
It's all been, that's one of the things that probably helps not being institutional, is that we're willing to work with in a kind of ill-defined world, where we're learning how a Mexican NGO works, and they're learning the kind of, we have a more of a Yankee American attitude towards, you get this project done, you allocate this money, it has to have deliverables, and that's really new to many of the Mexican partners we have. You know, you don't follow up and say, okay, we need a 2-page report on exactly how the money is spent. That is not really, that we found that that's a hard thing at times to get from Mexico. On the other hand, they find, you know, that our kind of, it's not our kind of not really caring about hierarchy. Yeah. So we'll, you know, I've gotten in trouble personally just by talking to the lowest level of our hierarchy on the reserve and asking them to do something without going through the upper levels first. And so you learn that, nope, you can't do that. Even if it's a small item.
Cultural structures are different.
The cultural structure, so that Americans are like, oh yeah, you want to do that, go do that. You know, but in Mexico, you really respect who is the head of an organization, who is the regional head, who is the person who works on the reserve level, and it doesn't matter if you spend a lot of time, it may only be an email, but you have to go through that levels. And we learn that. And we, you know, so in a funny way, it's not just binational. It's just when you're a small group, you can actually learn.
You have more flexibility.
Yeah, and you can learn faster. I mean, you know.
That's good. This is nice because we're moving from one of our questions that has to do with the relative effectiveness of networks and institutions to this second question, which is what does it take to do binational work? And this sort of, I just to follow up on something you said, do you think ambiguity then, that in some sense being informal and non-governmental allows you to be more flexible because you haven't bought in to a particular template? So the ambiguity of relationships and mission, or absence of an MOU.
Yeah.
Well, we do have an MOU.
But we do have them, but we haven't followed it. I mean, you know, basically we haven't even gone over it since our first time, and that was when we had 10,000 acres. Now we have 45,000. Yeah. And so, you know, I do think that it's a funny thing, ambiguity. I think the first, you know, I think that so many people have said this. Eleanor Ostrom in her work on organizations, and Mary Catherine Basin has written about this. But how do you develop a certain kind of ease of trust?
Yes.
I mean, it's not just trust. I mean, that's a big word these days. But it's a certain ease so that if you do screw up, or you say something wrong, or you are impatient one day, or you can't do it or the other person is just fragile, and it doesn't affect the organization except for a couple of days. I mean, it will affect it, but it doesn't have this lasting kind of effect that you want to go and do revenge on the other organization.
Right.
And that kind of ease took us, what, 3 to 5 years, I think? Something like that. I think we have it now.
Mm-hmm.
Do
you find that to be different from working, because you've worked in various capacities with organizations in the U.S., the Sky Island being one of them, the Alliance. Is that true for U.S. organizational structure, or is that particularly a border issue, or a Mexico?
I think the success has a lot to do with Diana, and it has a lot to do with her being bilingual, and I think it has a lot to do with her love of cattle ranching on both sides. And I think it has a lot to do with her cultural understanding of the families on both sides of the border. And I think that's so that one of the things that I would say is that individual personalities are incredibly important. And I think that, you know, Diana, I mean, the whole thing would not have happened without Diana's complete, you know, kind of love of everything from Magdalena up, you know. And so, and you know, she and her family worked in Mexico and had friends across the border. I mean, I think that's, you know, and I think that's so. When I talk about Genesis, I think one of the reasons we could generate this organization, we've been extremely successful. I mean, even to our own surprise. I mean,
Yeah, I think that's,
Well, it's a general consensus, everybody says so.
yeah, I mean, it's overwhelmed us.
Yeah, yeah.
yeah, it's sort of like, ooh, we didn't expect this to happen. Now what do we do next, you know?
And so an interesting thing happened, I mean, in terms of learning. We did what Naturalia asked. We got money for them to buy land. In fact, we got so much money that we've now pressured them to find us adjoining pieces of property, because that's their role, is to do that kind of negotiation. And we found out that in Sonora, many of the titles have never been written.
Or they aren't clear. They're not
completely,
clean titles.
or they're not even there. In some way.
There are a couple places that we found that don't actually have titles. So.
And so we find that some person will claim that they own it, then you go to the title and it's in a different title person. And that's what's holding up the organization now, is not, oddly, it's not what other organizations are concerned with, which is funding in difficult times. It's understanding how you work in Mexico when you have unclear titles, and finding really the right lawyer. We never had thought about legal expenses, but now we're into finding lawyers who can help us work through that tangle of stuff. So,
But then we're back again to laws and institutions, aren't we?
absolutely.
And they're really important in the final, you know, if we can finally get the Jaguar Reserve federal recognition, it's going to protect it from mining, it'll protect the waters on the Oros River, and that's the ultimate goal, is that finally we do need them.
So ultimately what Diana is saying is that the final goal is legal and institutional.
Yes.
And we're trying to make it so attractive, our reserve, that the institution, mainly the federal government, it's very top-down.
Right.
Will, and we didn't even know this when we started, that the only way to really protect it and get not the surface rights, but the underground rights, the mineral rights, protected from suddenly being mined, is to get a federal decree. It's the only way. There's no such a thing as a national park, that doesn't do it. There's no such thing as a national forest here. Again, that's what Naturalia is trying to do. That's that we assign, as these things come up, we're learning how to assign.
Divvy up the work.
Yeah, divvy up the work. Sure.
Naturalia, how would you compare that to an organization like Pro Naturalia?
Oh, we don't want
I don't know.
to.
Okay, go.
They're both conservation groups.
Groups. Okay. I didn't mean it in a
but I
serious
mean,
way. I just wanted to know.
I understand. And Naturalia is a group that came out of Mexico City and is the group that produces Especies, the only major conservation magazine, we'll show it to you, in all of Mexico.
Yeah, okay.
And so they have been very strong on educational aspects of conservation and endangered species. And so they took it on themselves to find, so they're led by species, we can say that, as an organization. And so they're interested in the wolf, they're interested in the prairie dog, they're interested in the jaguar. And that's how they function. They function by focuses on species. And they had never really been in Sonora. That was, in a funny way, that cultural is as much a cultural change for Chilango's as it was for Americans. I mean, so they had to learn the northern New Mexican culture, and I think that took a while.
Yeah.
I mean, Juan Carlos took, was it 3 years now in Sonora? So they set up an office in Hermosillo. They understood they could not do it from Mexico City. They were so effective that Nature Conservancy gave them a whole reserve, which was Fresno's reserve, to be the guardians of. So because they were so good at the Jaguar Reserve, they then established themselves as the kind of lead group on the inland part of Sonoran, not the coastal. Coastal is a different.
Just one more questions on this institutions, networks thing. There's always a question of whether or not you set up these institutions and then there's not the money or the will to monitor their borders or to staff them. Someone said the Pinnacottes are in very good shape actually, but they don't have any resources.
Well, one of the things that we're doing is we've got an endowment fund.
Okay,
and
great.
In fact, I'll hand you a letter about our endowment fund, our fundraising letter for the summer. And the idea is that we will have enough money invested through this stewardship and management fund to pay the basic maintenance and taxes and keep the reserve protected permanently. And without some kind of an endowment, you have that danger, like you say, of having the reserve invaded by poachers or land grabbers or marijuana growers or whatever. So,
and again, let's say this is a good example of the binational learning. Private reserves are very, very, very rare in Mexico, and so we brought the knowledge of somewhat of how the private reserve works, like creating an endowment fund. And so there was that learning again from both sides of the border. On the other hand, we also learned there were no such things as conservation easements in Mexico.
Or it's not quite the same as
it's not
what
quite
we
the same.
are understanding.
And so we're trying to see if we can invent something called conservation easements. On the other hand, Naturalia did this amazing thing of helping set up these camera contests.
Yeah, actually that was our treasurer, Rick Williams. It was his idea, and Rick and I are the co-founders of the organization and the incorporators. And Rick had this idea a few years into the, after we got the reserve expanded and had it operating pretty efficiently, of creating friendships around the reserve, not through the defender's model of payments for carcasses, payments for depredations, but payments for live animals. And so what he got set up was contracts with neighboring ranchers, and cameras are set out according to the number of acres on their ranch or the number of past depredations. So there's a little bit of flexibility there, but there's a formula for it. And what we do is pay 5,000 pesos for a photograph of a jaguar, and so many thousand pesos for an ocelot. And these are ranchers who really depend on the income from their cattle sales to for their livelihood. It's not wealthy absentee ranchers who don't care about their livestock. These are folks who really depend on their livestock sales. And what has amazed us is that in this part of Mexico, there's none of that sort of political rhetoric that you find among ranchers in this country, where there's political reasons for opposing environmental, for opposing conservation initiatives. It's just going to get opposed on general principle, not because of specific elements of that conservation initiative. None of that exists in Mexico, in this part of Sonora in any case. And so people have been incredibly receptive, and they love it. And the Sahuaripa newspaper, which comes out over email, actually has got all of these articles about the jaguar on our ranches and how proud they are of it. And, we had nothing to do with that. We set up this program called Fotos Felinos. It's photographs of felines, of predators, and the surrounding ranchers have totally embraced it, just to our amazement.
And I think that, again, how that works in terms of networking, when we then presented that to potential American funders, the idea that we weren't doing it as compensation for dead cows, but we were doing it as a way of encouraging conservation among ranchers was such a positive idea that we started to get funding through that innovation of, and not going into the details or, well, for one thing, it was impossible as a biologist to go in and find a carcass. I mean, this is some of the
roughest country
that I've been all over Africa, and this is still a rough country. And so what we found is that just by doing this, we not only got good information, so now we've identified 10 individual jaguars. We started out with only one camera on the trail. Now we put 2, so we get both sides, and then we know the spot patterns.
Right.
So we started to, everything is a learning process, and I think one of the things about all this stuff of networking, which includes all these ranchers, is that you quickly pick up what you can advance very quickly, because another problem with institutional, and sometimes even with, and we have a little bit of this with academic stuff, is that they start out with one program, and if it's for an MA or a PhD or something, they have to stick with that program no matter what they've learned.
Mm-hmm.
So they may have learned, for instance, that what they're doing isn't quite producing the right data, but they're a year into it, right? So they don't want to change the form of data gathering. Well, we're not there. We can just change it pretty loosely. We can improve it quickly. And so a small genesis group, as opposed to, an institutional group, works very well there. And
one of the things that when I was working back then, Susan Anderson had been talking about really the need, if Mexico was going to do anything in conservation, was to bring in the commercial interests. Because there wasn't a lot of a social understanding. People don't have the resources to donate. Even time isn't donated. We've heard that as well. It's like everything is really so, Anyway, so that again is part of, I think, a novelty that you guys have worked with. It's commercial interest, the bank involvement. That's also.
I think it's very interesting. It's a big question, and one of the ones. When you talk to the Austins were very close to Cemex, and one of the brothers in Cemex is a great conservationist and has bought, let's say, the Sierra del Carmen for sanctuary. And so there is, again, Naturalia works with the Safari Club quite a bit. So there is that beginnings. And I think one thing that I think Helen was talking about that has happened is over the last, even just 10 or 15 years, there's a new generation of Mexican biologists. And that young generation is almost like we were in the 60s or 70s.
They're wonderful.
And they're spectacular. But it's new. The old way of doing things in Mexico was you became a biologist and then you did everything possible to go to UNAM and work in Mexico City in the museums.
These kids want to be out in the field.
And
that's what Alberto was saying.
They're fabulous.
Yeah.
And they weren't 20 years ago. They weren't there.
Exactly.
And that's another spectacular thing that happened with our organization. Camina and Miguel, the 2 Jaguar guardians, we couldn't ask for something more. We really lucked out. And that's in part because there is this new generational understanding. So besides institutions and laws, there's also the history. And we're at the right moment of history, and we're kind of surfing in on the right moment of history. So I would say that, with I won't talk about Cemex because I think it's good to talk to, but there is the beginnings. Remember, there's philanthropy in Mexico again was for the church. You gave money to the church. To have philanthropy for things like conservation is not really a Mexican understanding.
It's not part of their cultural history.
Yeah,
Right.
and so that has to come in over a 5, 10, 15-year period, and you know how it goes right now is Naturalia goes around with a little can, like you see for the Red Cross type things. with a picture of a jaguar in it at the zoo, and people put in little coins.
Right.
And that's the beginnings of charity for nature, if you want to call it that.
It's, you know, it's not the safari club that they work with, it's the Pueblo Zoo, and I'm not exactly sure what
Well, in especialistas,
yeah.
Do you think that the current negative climate between the United States and Mexico, and particularly with the state of Arizona, has an impact on what it is that you're trying to do?
Oh yeah, I had a TNC and NJP were putting on a luncheon meeting with SEDES, which is I guess it's kind of the Sonoran equivalent of the Game and Fish Department in a way, although it has a broader scope. And that was scheduled for 3 days after 1070 passed. And I immediately got an email and said, because of 1070, we're not coming, you know. So we're now going to organize that meeting in Mexico and bring. There were many more gringos coming to the meeting than Mexicans, which is why we decided to do it in Tucson.
Yeah.
But we'll all schlep ourselves down there to have the meeting there. So yeah, no, it has a huge impact.
And of course,
it needs to be repealed.
although we don't have the data, if you want to say, the fence is obviously, when it's a solid fence, is a barrier to jaguar movement. And since
it's not a fence, it's a wall.
Well, the Normandy
barriers aren't as bad.
The Normandy fence will not stop jaguars.
Yeah.
You know? And
but the walls
will. But the walls are also made mainly around urban areas where no jaguars are going to be anyway. So we haven't looked at exactly what kind of wall or what kind of fence is good, you know, is more permeable or less permeable. But there's no doubt that, you know, I think the major thing is the presence of so many federal troops and narcos and American Border Patrol. You know, that's not going to help the jaguars at all. And so, of course, that part is not.
In this part of Arizona, which is where the jaguars, I guess, are even moving up, what kind of fencing structure is there? It's the Normandy one?
No, it's the solid wall from
Douglas over to Nogales. No.
Yeah, pretty much from east of Douglas to Naco, and then I'm not sure about portions of the Tumacacori Highlands area, whether that's solid or whether there's some Normandy barrier in there. And then there are parts of the Oadam Reservation and the Organ Pipe Monument that have Normandy barrier instead of the solid wall.
Goldwater is, I was told, but I heard that they had put an organ pipe the pylon, so it's not the Normandy barrier, but it's
something that
holds people and ostensibly the farm can do that through. But we're going to actually interview organ pipe superintendent, so I'll let you know.
Yeah,
so on this eastern side of the border, though, it's
from east of the San Bernardino through Antelope Wells, and then east of Antelope, probably all the way to Columbus. It's Normandy barrier.
Okay.
And jaguars should be able to get through that.
Yeah.
They should do that.
But it does.
As you're saying, it's it's all of the traffic. It's the disruption of the roadway.
Exactly.
There's all that.
There's all this other stuff that goes on. Yeah.
You know, a problem for jaguars is, of course, that now so many of the ranches are being owned by narcos, and so our control over poaching has probably gone.
Unless we can convince the narcos to be good conservationists.
Right. Go ahead,
which some of them probably are.
Yeah, maybe. I mean, but there's, it's just we don't know about it. And you have to be very. So I would say that the institutional and legal aspects of the frontier are now in chaos.
Yeah.
I mean, and because they're in chaos, we really don't have it. We can't really navigate in chaos. I mean, we try to keep a low profile. We're not trying to make any kind of statements, and and that's really what you have to do at this period of time.
In other words, you feel that the networks that exist, and yours is one of, quite there are a number of them, in different areas, whether it's food or water, or other kinds of wildlife, including the fauna. They are managing to hold things together that otherwise might be falling apart.
Yeah, I think we're positive. Yeah. I think I would say that.
And do you have a sense of a time frame for it sounds like you're going towards an institutional federal designation. Does something like Arizona set that back in a time frame, or your trajectory will continue regardless of
I think
state law?
We're an NGO that works in Mexico, and we flirt with U.S. stuff about jaguars, but we're not really that involved. There's a lot of groups in the U.S., Defenders, Center for Biological Diversity, Sky Island Alliance. They're all working They're working in a land that has only virtual jaguars. I mean, there are no jaguars left. So we're really the group that's working, and I think we have a little pride in that. And talks about kind of groups and institutions. I think our pride comes that we're helping the females. We're
helping the mama jaguars.
We're making more cubs. Everybody else can be looking for designated habitat under Section 7 of the ESA, and we just feel like.
So this is not a binational designation. You're not looking for any kind of park
Not yet.
Mexico. At the
Not
moment,
yet.
it's exclusively focused on trying to get something.
On that issue, we're working very slowly.
Yeah.
And
that's Laird and Joe Austin are the ones you want to talk to about that.
And I would say we're working on a 5 to 10 year understanding there. I think if no one is going to press it at this point, but Valère and Diana, among others, have very good relationships with CONOMP and all the institutions, and we're just building that up.
Yeah.
So we're building up that first sense, what I was talking about, ease and trust across the border. And we all make fun of the fence, and we all make fun of, and everybody is horrified at the drug stuff. So there is a commonality there, but there's no timeline, and I think it would be silly to put a timeline on it.
Yeah. It's interesting that as you talk about this, there are clear projects that come out. For example, the Jaguar Project. But a lot of the efforts have a long history of your own, as well as but the focus on the particular animal, the particular resource is what you're moving ahead on, not necessarily the institution. But that if you have a history, and this animal is one part of that history, does it? Isn't all of it?
I mean, I'm a maniacal birder. I never worked with cats.
Right.
Carlos Lopez works with cats, and Sonia
Carrillo works with
cats. And so what I've done...
You sleep with cats.
I sleep. So what I've done is I've done what I love. I took all my friends who were great birders down there, who all went for free. I mean, they didn't charge anything. We paid for food, maybe. And we looked around, and as we started to just have fun, because we were all maniacal naturalists at some time, we found like the southernmost bald eagle and the northernmost military macaws within a half mile of each other, found the northernmost breeding of the particular kind of warbler, the first records for, it goes on and on. And as we did that, then I can't remember who told me, but we applied for a Neotropical Migratory Bird Act grant, and we wrote it up carefully. I put in my friends who were also great birders, like Noel Snyder, and we got that grant. It was a modest grant, and every year we kind of build on that grant. And now we are the most intensively studied bird area of Sonora. And if this year goes well, we'll have Mexican counterparts for most of the work. So we're also feeding into that surf of new ornithologists or birders in Mexico and inviting them to the reserve. The reserve is hard. It's a hard place to be.
It's really hard to get to.
And it's very hard to live there.
A benefit.
Yeah. Yeah, well, it's a great benefit for the
reason the jaguars are there.
Yeah. But, I mean, some people go there and they can't take it. You know, they just can't take it. So, but anyway.
It's buggy, it's hot, it's cold in the winter, it's really, the road is just terrible.
So then I first got Sky Island, Tom Van Devender to do the vegetation surveys to help with the birds. And then Tom joined Sky Island Alliance, and I'm on the board of Sky Island Alliance. Talking about networks is very interesting, actually. I'm on the board of NJP, Sky Island Alliance. You're on what other boards?
Those are the main.
No, you're on. Come on, Diane. You're not fessing up. But anyway, Oscar Moctezuma is on the Sky Island board and on the NJP board and on the Wildlands board. If you go around, that is another way we've networked, is by being board members on different boards. And that way we get an idea of what everyone else is doing at the same time.
You know, this is, it has been interesting to me that networks seem to be held together not so much by constant communication, which is how network scholars talk about it, but instead shared history, ideology, experience, sometimes field work. But books have turned out to be, and pieces of paper have turned out to be really important aspects of networking because they are shared, you know, and articles, chapters in books. That's a kind of shared resource which people who are into it kind of read. Is that your experience? Maps.
Maps were the one that did us. We got Kurt Minke of Bird's Eye, and we got money through the Kaplan Fund to do a map of the Sky Islands from the Gila River all the way down to the reserve, an aerial photograph. And it took us a long time because if you want them fast, you pay corporate rates. If you can just let it happen when there are no clouds, then you get really much cheaper. And we made this, we can show it to you, this gigantic aerial photograph, and everyone loves it. They love to figure out.
And it has all of the property boundaries on it, and it has the owners. Now, some of that. So, in other words, if we identified that such and such was a really important place for a corridor, migratory corridor, we could contact all of the owners of the major properties in that area. It's come unglued.
But I mean, there's our reserve down there, and here's the Gila River up here. Sure. And so, by putting this all on one satellite photograph, that brings the network together. Oops. Nope. So, I mean that, and we're now still have funding to take this down to Alamos, which is where the next Jaguar Reserve is, and then across. Actually, it's right on here.
It's to the Sierra Bacatete on the Yaqui indigenous lands near Wyoming.
So one thing about networks that's interesting is who decides to enter the network.
Yeah.
How do you make it big? And so there was a cooperative of Yaqui women who approached Naturalia saying that they wanted the Sierra Bacatete to be a conservation area, and could Naturalia help them? So all of a sudden we were down in the Sierra Bacatete, and we put up camera traps. And what?
Or Naturalia put up.
Not Naturalia.
Yeah, we really have.
Naturalia. Yeah. And we have a jaguar sighting, which is the closest one to the Sea of Cortez that has been photographed. So now, rather than doing cross-border interest, we also have an east-west correlate interest. And we've now networked.
And another nation,
Right.
although they're not technically nations in the way Native Americans in the U.S. are nations, but another.
And hopefully when we
ethnicity.
get down to Alamos, there's a series of conservation groups, one of which is from Natura. And we've just barely done discussions. But when we do that, I was talking with Carlos today, said he's now talking to all the local ranchers. He gets an idea of who shot a jaguar when, he puts it on the map, have there been sightings of jaguars. And so now we're moving the idea of what the border is down almost to the
Farther
Sonora
south.
border.
Yeah.
And so what by starting this much, we're really adding on. And the World Wildlife Fund just asked, and we had lunch with them. We don't know what they're going to do or anything, but they were very curious. And they're working over here in Chihuahua.
In the Chihuahuan Desert.
That's Mark Briggs or someone else.
Well, he's working for them. Yeah.
So they now are kind of interested in the foothills on this side, which actually we don't know very much about. I mean, we don't in terms of jaguars. And so it begins to expand, and we will grow through growing pains. That is one of the things.
Yeah.
At what point do we need another person to help us? Diana's overwork, I'm overworked. We're all volunteers. So at one point,
I'm so glad I asked the question because this map is just terrific.
yeah.
So one of the things that is dangerous when you put things on maps.
Yeah, that's.
And I wonder, especially with large, sexy species that can economically be viable for being dead,
It's always a danger.
And we're being.
Yeah, sure.
Another interesting aspect of networking that you might be interested in commercial is that right next to our reserve is an UMA, which is a kind of, how would you describe it?
Unidad Manurea Ambiental, and it's a Mexican system for allowing ranchers. Are you familiar with the UMA system in Mexico? That you declare that your ranch is going to have conservation goals. You're going to either cut back on the number of cattle that you're stocking, or you're going to do something that will benefit the environment on your property. And in exchange for that, you get the right to sell hunting permits for particular animals. In this case, it's usually white-tailed deer. And so there is an UMA just to the east of us, on the east side of the Yaros River, which is the longest undammed, keeping their members in line because they're having some livestock losses, and they need to find other funding for maintaining the kind of balance that they've got.
I think what's interesting here is that they have a different structure than we do. Naturalia is very much a no-hunting organization.
Right.
And until recently was a no cattle. Now they're allowing a little bit of cattle to make the transition of jaguars from cattle to allowing the deer to have a leaner population. So again, there's a learning curve that goes on. But the UMA is trying to get a permit to have an American or some wealthy hunter, be able to shoot a jaguar with an anesthesia so that they can then put a collar on it to track it by satellite. So,
and Rodrigo Medellin, who is in charge of this huge program of counting individual numbers within populations of endangered species in Mexico, is the person who came up with that idea as a funding mechanism. So it's had some acceptance in other parts of Mexico.
And the problem we have with it is that the last 3 jaguars to be anesthetized all died.
So
we've for our reserve, we've said, although we would learn a huge amount if we put collars
From a
on.
collar jaguar.
Yeah, but we've said until
You can figure out.
we feel that anesthesias will not kill a jaguar, we won't do it. So that's kind of been, I mean, that brings you together. So Naturally and NJP were very clear on that. And so you're beginning to see the gradations of kinds of conservation attitudes. You know, you have the Americans trying to designate critical habitat where there are no jaguars. You have boomers trying to get money by shooting a jaguar, but for conservation, you have us being
Not shooting a jaguar, injecting it with
the
anesthetic, yeah.
What? You shoot darting.
Darting a jaguar, yeah, that's a better term.
Yeah. I mean, so you're beginning to see, and then all of a sudden, without anything to do with us, a ganaderia, a cattlemen's association, near us, decided that they were going to be a ganaderia for jaguars. And they formed their own group.
Their own group to support jaguars.
To support, and we had nothing to do with it. So there's also that weird threshold effect.
Yeah.
And who knows how you judge that, or when it's going to happen, or when it doesn't happen. I mean, it's kind of like magic or something. It just suddenly appears.
It's probably a real big simplification to ask you whether you're optimistic or pessimistic about the future, but I think it would be fair to say that this has been a very up conversation. You've seen this take off more than you expected.
Yeah.
Oh, sure. This is I mean, like the Mount Graham Red Squirrel is a very down story.
Yes, exactly.
This is the opposite. So,
Right.
But you know, we could hit the wall at any time, so you know.
Yeah, at this point, there seems no reason for us to hit the wall. The worst threat I would see are either mining or narcos. I mean, those would be the two. Yeah. I think the actual ambience of Sonora is very supportive of conservation.
And despite the negative impact of the larger politics, what you're doing moves ahead. I mean, it's the inconvenience of the meetings and things, but it's not spoiled your relationship.
Yeah, it hasn't.
Well, and in fact, what I've heard is that it's a commonality. You almost say that the Mormon fence is a communal joke because you're coming from the
because
same
it doesn't
place.
work and it was a stupid idea.
Right. But that your Mexico colleagues sort of
Agreed.
share your
Absolutely.
perspective about that, and so it becomes
Absolutely.
Yeah, I mean, that's it. And I'd also say that because we are an American group that only works in Mexico, at least at this point, I mean, as far as the actual work, money comes from every place we can get it. We've gained a certain amount of respect because we bring in the money. I mean, you know. And what's happening in Sonora is not really almost a binational issue. I mean, if we can make the population of jaguars increase in Sonora, then, you know, it's like waiting for the Berlin Wall to fall. I mean, if it's 20 years, but there are a lot more jaguars,
They'll come back.
they'll come back. You know, I mean, I understand the anxiety and the passion of Americans to get jaguars back in the United States, but really, from a long-term survival of the species, I'm a little. I mean, I've seen species come and go in my life, so if I can get a good population in Sonora and Chihuahua and Sinaloa and make all those connections, the fence will come down. It's one of those. I mean, it's like the Berlin Wall, and at that point, the jaguars will take off in that direction. So we don't feel the same anxieties as many of the people working in the United States, especially after the death of Nacho B. You know, the only known resident jaguar was killed by, or in the process of the agencies trying to.
Inefficiency.
Yeah. So we're not part of that. I need
to turn that off because it only does it for about an hour, and then, yep, this is exactly the right time. So maybe this is a good
So
time.
how is the math around school?
Hardly.
Yeah.
Just hardly.
Yeah, of course it would.
So predictions.
Yeah, I mean, there's
250.
125 females maximum, right? And, the university wants more telescopes, and climate change has pushed it up off the mountain.
And all those
and insects
different plagues came in from the north, and other ones came in from the south, and so the forest is in bad shape.
Yeah,
it's really sad.
And although the Apaches and other tribes tried very hard and made some progress on the mountain, it's a sacred mountain, they do everything to postpone it. So what's interesting right now is the university has no permit, and it's still operating telescopes. And everyone is so afraid to do another environmental impact statement that they let the university continue without the permit.
So they don't want to count them.
Well, no,
They
they
do count them.
They do count them, but now they only count them in the fall when there's a lot of juveniles. They don't count them in the spring after the juveniles have died from starvation or predation. So they always get the largest number possible. It's all very orchestrated, and the guy who's doing the squirrel biology for the university is Guy Kuprowski. He's straightforward. He's not trying to do anything to distort the data, except he will not challenge the Forest Service to use a different technique. So he accepts their numbers as if they have realities. It's all. It's not a.
I wanted to go back. You had said that the ranches down there are in sort of turning over now to drug traffickers, whereas in the past.
No, I didn't mean to say that.
Okay.
That they're not in our area.
Oh.
We haven't had problems with that.
Because it's mostly family ranches that have been
Yeah.
in existence for eons, right?
They're private ranches. There's one ejido in our area, but there's only one.
And each ranch has its own personal reasons for keeping it or turning it over. The ranch we bought, Sotasuret, was an older man with 4 or 5 children, wanted a ranch closer to, we wouldn't have to travel so far. So he sold the ranch and bought another ranch closer by, got his children to agree to it. Everyone has a different reason for it.
Is ranching viable, or is that?
It's like here. It's pretty marginal.
The rancher who's next to us is also a dentist, so it has that same thing like in the United States.
Two streams of income.
Two streams, and many of the ranches have that. We have a rule, of course, you can't grow dope and be part of the Jaguar Project, and we've had one trouble with that, and they're out of the project. But in general, there's a lot of younger professional children of the old ranchers.
They don't want to do it. It's too much work.
It's too much work. They're also urbanized, but they want the ranch.
Right.
They love to take their kids out there. They
Barbecue once a month.
Things like that. So yeah, everything is changing, and that's.
So Bill Martin did that study a long time ago on ranchers. They do it for the love of it, and it was kind of interesting to have an economist, a hard-nosed economist, write an article that said, ranching makes no economic sense, and people keep doing it for the love of it, not because of any kind of incentive.
Yeah.
So I would like to go back and get Diane.
Well, that's really why I stopped this, thinking that I would start it again with Diane. Okay, so I think we ought to start with Diana Hadley, and beginning with that same kind of question about your background and how you got involved in conservation along the U.S.-Mexico border.
Well, I grew up in Tucson, and then I lived on a ranch, a family ranch east of Douglas, on the Arizona-New Mexico border for years. And so I remember Tucson when there were 300,000 people in the state of Arizona, and this was a little town. We used to go out to the El Conquistador Hotel, which is now a gigantic shopping mall, and our evening entertainment on summer nights would be to take a big, powerful flashlight and watch the coyotes chasing jackrabbits, you know. So I've seen Arizona get ruined, and it's very personally painful to me. So I also came to see that that certain ranches were really tools for conservation and species preservation, whereas others weren't. And I suppose that's kind of really what initiated my interest in conservation. Also, our ranch was right on the border, and so I learned Spanish from talking to my neighbors and talking to vaqueros, and my Spanish is not what Peter says bilingual, but it's a bad Sonoran accent in Spanish, and I know all the names for plumbing parts and horseshoes and stuff, but there are certain types of conversations that I can't have very well. So that, and then my professional life as a historian and editor at the Arizona State Museum gave kind of a nice combination for doing this type of work, because I've done a lot of specific environmental histories of localized areas, and I have that kind of historical background and cultural and ethnic history to bring to this organization. So I'm the one who always is, wants to know about the history of the individual ranches that are part of the Jaguar Reserve, and the cultural history of Sahuaripa and the Opata people, and I have that perspective to offer, whereas Rick Williams has the economic perspective, his management skills. Peter has the biology and the non-cat biology, whereas Carlos Lopez has the cat biology. So we all have these different skill sets that we contribute.
How important has it been to sort of archive and write up the histories? Because I know you've spent a lot of time writing about these areas and ranches and families, and those become, as you were saying, they're sort of testaments to areas and places. They're as important as the networks of the people.
Well, I haven't started doing that for the area around the Jaguar Reserve, and I'm not sure that I've got the energy to do it anymore, but it would be a very interesting history to have.
But that was very much part of your history.
Yeah, that's very much part of my history. And in doing that, I've always looked at the interaction between extirpations of wildlife species and, how the ranching community had impact on the biological survey and different government agencies that were active. It's very interesting that with all of the criticism that Americans often make of Mexico and Mexican agencies, there's actually more wildlife in Mexico than there is here, and you have to look at landholding patterns and cultural attitudes and remoteness of different areas and cultural choices for living situations. All of those come into play in explaining why Mexico has a greater species abundance and better attitudes actually right now than rural communities in this country have about conservation.
Yeah. One of the things you said earlier, maybe before we turned the tape on, was that ranchers in Mexico seem to have, at least in part, because of the photography project, but even before that, less polarized position vis-a-vis environmental groups and conservation?
Yeah, absolutely.
Talk a little about that.
Well, we just don't find that sort of knee-jerk right-wing reaction to conservation initiatives among the Mexican ranchers that we've met. They're hunters. And some of the ranchers individually are, really want to get rid of all the mountain lions and all the jaguars because it interferes with their economic benefits. But others don't share those attitudes at all, whereas here you find much more of a united front among the cattle growers associations, particularly the cattle growers associations.
But to be fair to the Malpai group,
the Malpai group is unique. And
it passed a ruling that no one would shoot a jaguar on 12 ranches in southeast Arizona and southwestern New Mexico.
And they set up a fund to give compensation to any rancher who could show that the livestock depredation came from a jaguar.
And with the allotments, that covers 1 million acres.
Yeah. And I think that the Altar Valley Alliance has also done the same kind of thing, because Macho B showed up fairly frequently in that area.
Is there a difference in the sense of private property here than in Mexico? Because I know that when I was working on the border, that was such a big part of NAFTA, for example. That was just, this is the U.S., claiming private property rights. How did property rights? I know those are different, but these sound like they're private inholding, private ranching.
Oh, the majority in this part, in the part of Sonora that we're working in, is private property.
But do they have the same cultural perspective that we have in the U.S.?
Here belongs to me.
They probably do.
Okay.
They probably do. I mean, it's, private property. There were a lot of confiscations during the Mexican Revolution and after the Mexican Revolution. Mm-hmm. And then under President Echeverria, there were a lot of ejidos were declared in the state of Sonora. And some big ranchers lost their properties at that time. And so actually, interestingly enough, I would say that private property is less secure in Mexico than it is in the United States, but it's much more vigorously defended in the United States, and because of the allotment system with the Forest Service and the BLM, there is this kind of assumption, because you sell your allotment with your private property and they're attached, there's this kind of sense that even that you have some proprietary rights to government land that actually belongs to the nation, and you don't have that kind of situation occurring in Mexico. So because of the sort of tentative, possibly changing relationship between the private property and the allotments that go with it, maybe that's what has caused many ranchers in this country to become more defensive and to take this more sort of solidified political position about private property rights.
Right.
I would say on both sides of the border, though, ranchers are not as concerned with jaguars as they are wolves.
Oh yeah, no question about it.
And that's common to both sides of the border. I think wolves really upset Mexican ranchers, and they really upset American ranchers. So
why not jaguars?
Well, if you had to be killed by a wolf or a jaguar, I think all of us would choose to be killed by a jaguar. It's fast, it's quick, it's not a pack, you're gone. And, there are, in the historical record, I've interviewed ranchers who said, you should have seen what happened when I was a kid, and we'd find this cow and her calf, and it wouldn't be quite dead, and they're really horrible stories about wolf packs and the way they operate, and so I think that's part of it. And also jaguars, there were so few of them in Arizona or New Mexico that they haven't presented the same problems to ranchers as wolves did. The last wolf pack in the Animas Valley, for example, and I forget, I think maybe it was in the 40s, but one member of the wolf pack was a dog that had Douglas, Arizona dog tags on her collar, and it had been living with and traveling with this wolf pack and doing depredations. And it was killed by the Biological Survey at the time.
I also think jaguars are lone hunters
Right.
rather than pack
Yeah,
hunters.
they're not pack
And
hunters.
so,
That makes a huge
and I think there's some feeling like this is just a gang getting us with the wolves, where the lone jaguar, is not. And jaguars are not known for like going through a herd of sheep and just knocking off a lot of sheep.
Yeah.
And they, in fact, at times rob the carcasses from mountain lions.
Mm.
And so, they have a different, they're the king of our beasts, they're the queen of our beasts in North America. And they really hold that. Yeah.
I'm really interested in part of this network theory is that networks don't necessarily just include people. They can include inanimate objects and also other living beings. And when you were talking earlier about finding the jaguar closest to the upper Gulf, and how you redraw your map, at least in part,
the piece of paper becomes,
in part in response to your discovery of these animals who are teaching you things all this time. That part of your learning process is not just from other people, but also
from the animals themselves.
Who then changes your map and then changes your relationships, because then other groups get interested in it because it overlaps territories that they're interested in.
Yeah, that's even true on our reserve from doing the bird surveys. All of a sudden, where everyone's talking about a corridor for jaguars, now we're looking at what's the corridor for the rufous hummingbird, because it showed up, and that's a completely different corridor. Or, also we never expected in the winter the birds from the high Sierras to come down to our reserve. So we have elevational migrants. So all of a sudden we're now thinking, oh my Lord, we have to think about that
up and down
corridors as well as north-south or east-west corridors.
Well, I imagine climate change.
And exactly.
Has tremendous impacts on it.
So.
Am I right to say this is an ecotone?
Yes. Between Sinaloa and thorn scrub, or foothills thorn scrub, some people call it.
The edge of both.
Right. The beginnings of the Madrerian oak woodland, very small pieces. An amazing mixed riparian, which has some of the what they call the tropical deciduous forest, but also has mixed oak with palm. There are oak palm forests, which are really unique. And so, but I mean, the foothills area are basically Sinaloa and thorn scrub.
One of the things we haven't talked about is indigenous people. And earlier, Dan, and you talked about property rights and the ejidos and their establishment. Do indigenous people have any role in what we've been talking about? Is there an aspect of either their land rights or?
Well, in the area where we're working in Sonora, the Opata were the major indigenous group. And the Opata became auxiliaries of the Spanish army, and they lived in all of the villages like Sahuaripa and Bagadehuachi and Bavispe. Those were Opata towns. They were farmers, they were sedentary people, Piman speaking, and they became absorbed into the Spanish culture very early on. And what happened was the last Opata speakers kind of disappeared early in this century. Dave Yetman has a book coming out about the Opata, and should be out in a few months. So there aren't really any indigenous people left in that area. I guess the closest ones would be the Yaquis, and then the Tarahumaras in Chihuahua. Mayos in Sinaloa, southern Sonora. So it hasn't been an issue with any native people in the area.
Right. Okay.
I think the issue comes in the United States with the Argonne Reservation, and they do not publish or make public any of their observations of jaguars, and they've been very circumspect about joining any groups related to jaguars. So
They're worried that people will find out they're there.
it's hard to know exactly what the motivation is.
Right.
But that's somebody that you guys should talk to, who's the person who's the head of their natural resources department.
Who's that now?
I think it's a woman it's recently changed. I'm not, but you can just call
Yeah,
up
well,
cells
we're
and
going to see
find
Joe
out.
Joaquin tomorrow, so we
Yeah.
went out to the new museum there at Town.
Oh, yeah.
I'll ask.
And Bernard Siqueiros is the other person that you should
yeah.
talk to. And he'll be at the museum too.
Yeah?
Is there anything else that you'd like to say, either one of you?
Well, one of the things that I've always been really think is effective and helpful to networking is to have workshops and conferences. And so I've organized 2 or 3 conferences on grasslands and grassland preservation and restoration. I did one on prairie dogs over in the Janos area, and that led to the first publication, bilingual publication by the Forest Service, focusing partly in Spanish with English summaries and articles in English with Spanish summaries. And that, I think, probably contributed to getting the Biosphere Reserve set up in the Janos area. There was a huge effort that didn't come to anything with the San Pedro and trying to expand the Ajos Bavispe Reserve, which was established back in the 1930s. And that was an interesting situation of monkey wrenching a really, really major binational conservation effort, and just the history of how that got axed is something that is really worth talking about, not with me, but with other people who were more involved in it. But there was this woman who worked, I'm not sure who she was working for. Maybe she was working with the WWF, but Gabriela Chavarria, and she raised something like $1 million, $2 million in 6 months to get the reserve expanded. And then, what's the woman's name? I can look this up for you because I really think this is worth pursuing, but there was a wife of a local rancher near Cananea who is actually an American citizen and raised in Los Angeles, but married to a Mexican rancher. And she is one of the knee-jerk right-wing activists who organized the ejidos in the area that had been ejidos that were made from the Green Ranch divisions around Cananea, and some of the labor unions who were working for the mine. And with their help, she was able to prevent any of the expansion of the reserve from happening and any of the benefits that had been planned through the whole salsa project from taking place. And anti-networking efforts can be, I mean, it's the other side of networking.
Well, it's another network.
It's another network.
Yeah.
And I think that you really need to look into that.
Actually, it's so interesting that you should ask that because it's in our basic questionnaire, but I've gotten so little out of it You know, it's what people, when I ask about it, people say, well, it's indifference, it's development, you know, it's growth. But actually, having an anti-network, I think, is quite a different matter, and this is a case of that. How did this happen?
You know, and one of the things that's interesting about networks is to look at what breaks the network as well as what holds it together. One of the tensions that occurs in networks is what we have come to call bragging rights. And so because the jaguar is such a charismatic big animal, everyone wants to say that they're saving the jaguar. And I would say that that causes more tension in the network than almost anything else, because other organizations will show a picture of a jaguar, will kind of fudge the language.
And they've never done anything.
And they've never done anything.
Right.
And so we've had, in a way it's been good, we've had to sharpen our bragging rights, you know, and make them very clear.
Self-protection.
Yeah, in order to keep the money coming, among other things.
Right.
But I think that's
not quite the same thing as these anti-networks.
Oh, yeah, right.
I think in some sense.
No, the one's an internal way that the network falls apart.
And the other is an external kind of monkey wrenching that is deliberate on the part of individuals.
One of the other distinctions about members of networks that other people have mentioned are the long-standing, deeply involved, embedded in place kind of conservationists who've been involved in numbers of activities, and then the kind of other groups that come in and swoop in at in the end and claim a victory, often cause more conflict because of their high profile.
Well, and here it's almost the other way. Here you have these small genesis groups like Naturalia and NJP, and then you have this hovering over of the big groups, trying to see if they can either take it over by absorbing your group or claim the bragging rights for, and so that's always a big tension, is between the local, and it's even within an organization. Maricopa Audubon was very much against, for instance, the telescopes, but the big Audubon, being out of Washington, was more wishy-washy about it.
Well, we were more cautious about what this
way more
them with their...
So there's always that kind of, and one of the advantages of these nodules like NJP is that we're not beholden to them. And that gives us not only the ability to create networks, but frankly also to break them if we don't like them. You know, I mean, so that it's not a network as if it's forever. I wanted to say one more thing, just the networking. You know, it's like follow the money. One of the things that is useful about our board, I was on the All Species Foundation, which was a foundation, a global foundation, to finally get all the species on the planet recorded, of which only about maybe 40% are even known at this point. And then, but through there, I had created another network. I mean, that organization didn't survive, but I had created another network of other biologists out there and also funders. And some of those people now contribute to the Northern Jaguar Project because they're interested in what everybody in the old network is doing. So just by having created that, and it's
great.
And so you have this, you know, I don't quite know how to describe it, but it's like Ryan, for instance, or even through the Morocco with the, you know,
sort of reworking of relationships for a little bit different purpose.
Yeah, exactly.
I want to go back to these. What motivates these other networks? You say right wing, but what is
it? In the case of the Ajos Bavispe expansion, and Mario Serret would be somebody that you should talk to about that, and he's the director of the Ajos Bavispe Reserve in the Ajos Mountains near Cananea. And I think that Mario was around. Arturo Rodriguez is another person that would be wonderful to talk to. He's 86 and lives in Cananea, and he's the cronista for the town of Cananea, and he used to be the head of the Banco Ejidal, and so he knows all the ranchers and all the ejidos, and he knows the history of that area just unbelievably well. And they were both present for this disintegration of the whole San Pedro effort. I mean, and it's not completely dead, but the expansion of the reserve, I think, is completely dead. And there was funding to do that. And her motivation is probably the standard fear of ranchers losing. It's an American fear that we find much more in this country than in Mexico. Fear of losing control of your livelihood and your property. And I'm not exactly sure what else was going on there.
Would she have been bought out?
Well, she got the mine and the ejidos on her side, so
Yeah.
that was a powerful batch of opposition. Federal interest in Mexico,
No,
maybe? Mineral. Oh, well, yeah.
But so they were worried about their ability to.
No, because mineral rights, you can make a mining claim. I'm not really sure about this, but I think this is the way it works in Mexico. I could go in and put a mining claim on anybody else's private property.
Right.
So.
No, I think what Wendy is saying is that if it became federal land, then the miners were thinking they might lose their jobs. Because it was now going to be federal
expansion of the
federal protection, and so they wouldn't be able to mine further. And so you get the unions on your side because you say you're going to lose your jobs.
Yeah.
That's what I had heard back then.
Right. I think that was why. I think it was a combination of everyone's fear of losing their economic base.
Well, and at that point, the whole smelter triangle stuff had been pretty successful, and so there was also some history around the mine.
Well, and that's another part of my personal history, was living in Douglas when the smelter was still going on, and there were several different organizations, Dick Camp's organization and several others, that were working on getting the smelter either cleaned up or closed down, and then when Phelps Dodge essentially decided that they didn't want to continue with that smelter because it was economically inefficient, it was already just
environmental.
Yeah, they blamed it on all of the environmental groups, and the environmental groups didn't even want to say, "Oh yeah, look, we could shut him down," because we hadn't, So
Well, it is. That's why there's this sort of vague, inchoate sort of we would like to control our own lives kind of thing. But the market controls other people's lives, just as you say. There's more threat by international markets in a lot of ways than government control on much of these things. But somehow or another, that doesn't get to be part of the narrative.
No, it's interesting that way, especially with for instance, the cattle industry.
It's always the vast majority of the cattle in Sonora and Chihuahua are sold to the United States.
Right.
I mean, it's the U.S. that controls that market. So.
Another part of this is the relationship of networks to narratives. Clearly, who is it that controls the story, and what kind of a story?
Well, we ran into that. It was really funny, actually. There was a whole period of time when there was a rumor that we were going to helicopter in Jaguars and drop them into the reserve. And I mean, that was one of the great stories, and so we didn't know, are you supposed to do a counter narrative, or do you just let
it die?
Let it die by itself. And, and having been in politics, you always have to make that decision. Because sometimes by countering it, you raise its energy, and so we just let it die by itself, and luckily it died. But that's always a really interesting part of, who has the stories going on, and we've heard incredible stories, that have nothing to do with what we're doing, about supposedly what we are doing.
One of the other things I'm struck by, and we haven't really talked much about this, but is the iterative learning that has happened both in your histories, though, Mount Brown Red Squirrel, here we are now also talking about a much more sexy, endangered species, but all the learning that you do in those early stages of your career and your life then lead to making better choices maybe this time around or whatever. You're just more knowledgeable, I guess.
There's also a sense of place and loss. There's nothing like long-term history with any place in the American West to create an environmentalist. If you were here 30, 40 years ago, the amazing changes are so instructive. And it is that experiential knowledge that no amount of counter-narrative is going to convince you that it's a better environment.
When I was in politics, the hardest thing was that Americans moved on the average of once every 4 years. And you cannot create the network between land and people in that amount of time. And it just doesn't work. And so if you're a politician who's promoting a connection between land and people, you lose that. First of all, you spend too much energy trying to convince your constituency to vote for you, and then they're gone.
Right.
I mean, so it's just. But the other thing is that it's so much easier to.
And yet, the long-term relationships of people to land in regenerative networks are the things that really sustain them over time. That sense of history, not only with the resource, but with one another, and who can be trusted and who can't.
Diana can talk about it, but I think Southeast Cochise County and parts of Hidalgo County had some of the most intact families of any place.
Yeah, they do.
I mean,
the least turnover of ranch ownership. They stayed multi-generations in the same family, and that's true in both of those areas.
And that's so different from Sonoita, which is growing like crazy, Nogales, which is just this tumultuous turnover of people who are trained completely.
Right. So this may be part of the other reason for a different attitude, the lack of turnover.
Yeah, it's, but personally,
well, and that may be what is, well, I don't know about with the Gila. It's interesting because the New Mexico Cattle Growers Association, and particularly in Catron County, is the most sort of virulent anti-conservation.
they're mostly against wolves.
And they've set up these little bus protection things for kids who are going to take this bus to go to school. Silly stuff. But and I think that there's been more turnover in that area, and because of the Gila wilderness, there's been more attention on that area. So you get someplace like Eastern Cochise County or Western Hidalgo County that are real backwaters where there hasn't been much turnover, and there isn't. The Malpai Borderlands group has been able to blossom in that area because they don't feel threatened the way ranchers in Sonoita, who were really trying to ranch, which I don't know how much of that is still going on in that area, but the threats are less in an unpopular spot.
Yeah. Well, this is really, really very interesting. I'm sure that the social history, that's sort of what I was trying to get at with my indigenous peoples question, that we've struck a much richer strain here with these ranching families.
Yeah.
Are these often binational families or Mexican families that stay pretty?
No, there are not too many. There hasn't been a whole lot of. That's a whole different cultural history. If you compare the town of Douglas to the town of Nogales, Douglas didn't have a Mexican city council person until the late 1970s or 1980s, whereas Nogales, you've always had very prominent Mexican families that have been part of the power structure of that town. Douglas was really a Phelps Dodge town. It was even portions of it were planned. in the Pullman model of the perfect industrial town where everything works really well and easily. So the Mexican population there, dual pay scale until after World War II in the smelter. So that's all changed now, but 30 years ago it was very much a white town. And the branch families have not, you find very few Mexican ranchers or ranch wives or integrated marriages.
Fascinating. Well, this has been a very rich, thank you both. This has really been helpful. It was not, as much as anything, I really appreciated the conversation about networks. I think we made some real headway, or at least I did intellectually here. Thank you very much. Maybe you already knew it, but
I never think, I just do it.
Yeah.
The person I mostly worked with or think about intellectually that way is Eleanor Ostrom.
Yes.
And, Javier Basuto, who you'd like you to meet, was her student for 3 years. And
I think her work has been so important, and it's been such a great thing. It was great for economics to have a political scientist win the economics prize. It was really terrific.
Yeah.
It was absolutely wonderful for women because my best friend in college was in graduate school with Lynn, and she was a little bit older than some of the other students, but then she had this relationship with Vince, and it was all very hush-hush. And then when she went to Indiana, she was not a member. I mean, she was just a graduate student advisor. She had no formal role there for years and years. She just was exploited.